Before I begin, I just want to say that I'm aware in this rather cobbled together paper that it comes across as rather simplistically binary, and acknowledge that there's a lot more complexity to the subject, but time doesn't really allow exploring that complexity. At the Canadian War Museum, we have historically positioned the conduct of war as a primarily masculine activity. This has been the result of the fact that, like many others, this museum developed within a set of specific impulses. These centered on honoring service and sacrifice, glorifying past accomplishments, and encouraging enlistment. More often than not, this discourse resulted in military history exhibitions and collections in which men dominated. The current population of Canada, however, is slightly more than half female, which means that a significant number of people, if not actively fighting, are reacting, supporting, or objecting to war in ways that have been less thoroughly documented and displayed. Part of the post-war reassessment and recovery of a greater female presence in the majority of historical fields, as well as art history, has led in recent years to an expectation of a far greater female presence in museum displays and collections than military history has traditionally supported. But is this expectation being met, and indeed, is it possible to meet it? Today, I'm going to attempt to address this question in a small way in the context of military art. I will conclude that it is important that we introduce gender as a category of analysis in museum work, particularly in war museums. My prime focus will be on the 20th century war art collections, for which I'm the responsible historian. And I have to admit at this point that some of the material I cover today is already published, as endless originality is impossible in the short term, in a chapter I wrote for a 2010 book from Routledge entitled Gender in Museums. But since I wrote that, there have been new acquisitions at the museum, the official program has been ongoing, and a recent student practicum has helped bring my interests more comprehensively up to date. The 2000-2004 Touring Art Exhibition, which you see up there in its Canadian Museum of Civilization iteration, Canvas of War, that I curated, first engaged my curatorial museological interest in the subject of women and war. It was based on the Canadian War Museum's 13,000 work art collection. At the time, the late 1990s, when I was developing the exhibition, I thought I offered a fair representation of women's roles in wartime in the exhibition by including depictions of First World War nursing and home front activities, as well as land girls and factory worker scenes. In the Second World War pictures, visitors could see women in uniform, frequently pursuing domestic activities such as cooking or serving food. The presence of these women notwithstanding, Canvas of War was still fundamentally about military history, and military history is traditionally about battle, strategy, operations, technology, defeats, and victories. It is not commonly about civilians. In this historical context, I could not make the role of women preeminent. Kirsty Robertson, the author of a 2001 MA thesis on the exhibition, remarked upon this limited female presence. In an article drawn from her thesis published in 2002, she made it clear why she thought women's presence was limited. She argued that, I quote, any inclusive intent was subsumed into a strategy of exhibition design, labeling, and press coverage that strongly emphasized a white Anglophone male experience of war, end quote. In terms of collections, it is not particularly difficult to arrive at another related explanation for the absence of women in the exhibition. Because the aspects of war considered historically important and relevant have been preeminently masculine, such collecting and recording projects as war art programs are inevitably end up, or at least almost inevitably end up, being organized by men with military backgrounds. They traditionally have been able to draw on specific knowledge and experiences denied women until relatively recently, and have tended, furthermore, and this is documented, to assume that women could not paint military subjects. Any exceptions have had only a limited impact on this overall situation. The First World War art program commissioned women artists such as Anna Airy on the right and Laura Knight on the left to paint behind the lines. And they painted men. Curiously, the only male commissioned artists appear to have painted women in the First World War, invariably nurses, and probably because they were overseas at the time that the nurses were depicted. In the Second World War, women artists employed by the National Gallery of Canada, including Peggy Nichol-MacLeod, and this is Salmon in the Galley, and Parasceva Clark, painted service women in Canada. Out of 32 Second World War artists commissioned by the government, working overseas and in Canada, only one was a woman, Molly Lamb Boback, and this is Private Roy. The authorities allowed her, Boback, to go abroad to paint only after the war in Europe was over. Fewer than 300 works resulted from these three women and their female colleagues' efforts, making only a small dent in the more than 5,000 artworks produced by the male artists on the subject of the Second World War. As the number of uniformed women was very small and civilians were not depicted as part of the program, a collection skewed in the direction of war as a military experience was largely inevitable. With the exception of very few, and I'm less than a handful of paintings, the museum owns no pictures of women receiving telegrams announcing the death of a husband or son, reading letters from overseas, listening, maybe worry etched on their faces with their children to news on the radio about the latest battles, struggling to make clothes with drapery fabric, going to work, coping, weeping. Nor does the museum have pictures of men in similar situations. The two recent official military art programs, the Canadian Armed Forces Civilian Art Program, CAFCAP, which ran from 1968 to 1995, and the current Canadian Forces Civilian Artist Program, CFAP, which commenced in 2001, have increased substantially the number of female artists employed, 25% in CAFCAP's case and around 15% in CFAP's. But in both cases, the fact that the artists work in theatre or on bases has not substantially altered the established subject matter of conflict as far as official art is concerned. Furthermore, and this is a bit of a sweeping judgment here, and something I can't explore in detail today, unofficial military art, when it is not illustrative work, remains to a notable degree a reaction to this omnipresent masculine model of military art. And this is and uses very often very similar subject matter. Since 2006, a team of 3 individuals at the Canadian War Museum and the Museum of Civilization, of which I am one, has been exploring the field of women in war from the research, exhibition, and collections points of view, with the goal of making recommendations for more inclusive collections development in the future. We have determined that generally museums do not describe artifacts that bear witness to wartime views of women in the context of women's lives. The Buzimi Mae West life preserver, for example, but on the grounds of their function. This means that not only are the collections primarily gendered male, but we fail to capture information that might shed light on men's attitudes to women in wartime as well. In mid-2007, in order to understand this aspect more fully, I briefly explored the War Art collection. I discovered 733 items catalogued with the words woman, women, or female as descriptive terms. This was using the database. When I reviewed these entries, however, I was surprised to discover several artworks of women that I consider important missing. To explore this situation more fully, I used the Second World War artist Geoffrey Bagley's work as a test case. Some years earlier, I had accidentally found one of his images in storage, a picture of a pin-up girl, in quotes. I therefore knew that women featured in his art. The catalogue lists 90 of Bagley's works in the collection, but images are attached to only 21 of the entries and 13 are untitled. The lack of the words woman, women, or female anywhere in the current cataloguing for his work precludes finding the painting that you're looking at right now, which is called Memory of the Crossing of the Atlantic, The Waiting Friend. The titles of several other entries, like the one above, are intriguing, but only one, Special Attraction Halifax has an image attached found by utilizing the word Wren under military affiliation. And Wren is the short-term form for women in the Women's Royal Canadian Naval Service. The irony of finding this image through its military affiliation, however, is that the cataloguing notes that the woman depicted, the special attraction, is not in fact a Wren, but a member of another unidentified volunteer service. Quite clearly, as the two less than subtle titles cited above imply, Bagley's work as a whole has something to say about male attitudes to women in wartime, but the majority of his compositions, which would be useful in identifying what they have to say, are not among the 733 catalogued items bearing the descriptors women, woman, or female, and so they're difficult to find. Over the past year, Elaine Goble, an undergraduate at Carleton University, has continued to look for women in the war art collection. To date, she has examined 5,530 artworks and found that women are present in 8% of them. In this 8%, approximately 80% place women in the foreground. Not unexpectedly, the Second World War artwork of Peggy Nichol-MacLeod and Molly Lamb-Bobak dominates. Because this work was commissioned, Sue's analysis underlines that only direct intervention ensured female representation in the collection, and that such intervention to date has largely been the work of men. I would argue furthermore that the motivation was not to provide a female perspective on war as much as it was to show that women could do or support men's work in wartime. 17 years ago, Edith Mayo contended in her 1994 article, New Angles of Vision in Gender Perspectives, Essays on Women in Museums, that neither women's nor gender history would be reflected in museum exhibitions and practices until there was a radical change of perspective. Has there been any change in perspective? In her 1992 publication by a lady, Maria Tippett included little-known Canadian artist Elizabeth Cann, so I'm going to say that Elizabeth Cann might be better known if you were in the other room. Extraordinary Second World War civilian portrait, The Soldier's Wife. A wonderful portrayal of female wartime anxiety. That she is not uniformed was and is important, but such work is rare to see even today. If contemporary artists such as Gertrude Kearns have widened the possibilities for women as war artists with innovative portraits of men such as General Romeo Dallaire, who witnessed the 1994 Rwanda genocide, portraits of herself in military uniform, and depictions of her own shattering experiences during a 2006 assignment in Afghanistan, she has not added to the non-uniformed female perspective, and furthermore, the bulk of her work does not feature women. And this is a typical example of the torture of Shidena Roan from Somalia from 1996. In contrast, Elaine Goble, another contemporary woman artist who depicts military material, produces work that does shed light on recent female experiences of war from outside the military context. Her work, however, has not received the sort of media coverage Kearns enjoys, and furthermore, she has not received the same military support. Jarrods Goodbye shows Colonel Dr. David Sanchagrin with his wife and 2 children on the eve of his 3rd departure for Afghanistan in 2008. Sanchagrin is shown as stoic and resolved, but emotionally detached from his family. Gestures of togetherness and affection in his wife and children are contrasted with his seemingly cold and rigid response, a response that hints at a tightly controlled mental state that is possibly the result of personal trauma. When My Dad Leaves Me from 2008 also reflects a similar theme. It depicts Captain Lorne Cooper reunited with one of his teenage daughters after a 2-year posting in Sierra Leone. Cooper has struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder, while his daughter has experienced her parents' divorce and painful rifts with her siblings. Grooming a horse named Caramel gives both father and daughter a buffer zone in which they try to heal their pain. The bucolic rural environment that represents one part of Cooper's life is contrasted with an insert that shows where his profession took him in Sierra Leone. The insert acts to separate the viewer from the lush scene in the same way the pony separates father and daughter, and his profession divides Cooper's life in 2. Without the photo insert, the viewer would not have much cause to question this pleasant scene. With it, he or she is forced to reflect on the mental baggage Canadian soldiers and their families carry with them, and in many cases, struggle to cope with. So where does this leave us? In terms of exhibitions at the War Museum, we do know that stories about women are popular, and this has had some impact on collecting habits. The 2007 War Museum exhibition, War Brides, the work of Calgary artist Bev Tosh, and Stitches in Time, London, Ontario-based artist Janine Madison, with her sewn memorial to Second World War women workers in Canada, demonstrated through their visitor numbers and positive viewer responses that women's stories and art have substantial appeal. 83,000 visitors saw War Brides at the War Museum, which was a respectable showing compared to the 117,000 visitors to Afghanistan in the adjoining gallery during the same period. At present, the museum has no work by Bev Tosh in its collection because her exhibit is still touring, but it has acquired the Madison works. More importantly, however, and in the context of Goble and Kern's work in particular, promoting different models on the subject of women in war in art comes down to an issue of gender as the sort expressed by Edith Mayo in 1994. We need to change the perspective. To do this, I would argue, museums such as ours need to introduce gender as a category of historical analysis in our research, collecting, and cataloging work regarding the histories of war. As Joan Scott argued as long ago as 1986, gender is one of the most fundamental ways in which we organize our intellectual, cultural, and political worlds. Until it is widely accepted that our understanding of war and the material culture of war is gendered, and this includes war art, we cannot easily provide a female viewpoint of war. We can certainly collect and exhibit war art pertaining to women in war and encourage artists to paint women's experiences, both military and civilian. But unless we can accept that for generations we have largely gendered our experiences and understandings of conflict, we will be unable to fully represent them. To try and make this point in art, I'm going to leave you with Gertrude Kearns' portrait of General Lewis Mackenzie. This portrait became a poster, and now there are 20 more poster subjects of this kind, plus the drawings and paintings in some cases associated with them. You may not be surprised to learn that the posters, which present the men, often from the Canadian High Command, rather like action figures, are very popular with their subjects. In my opinion, this positive reception at once encourages Kearns to do more of the same, but I believe that in so doing, she unwittingly reinforces a dominant male view of war as a warrior culture that makes any attempt to change the perspective all that much harder.